I recently read through, hi, I'm Janice Switlo. I recently read through a book by Jonathan Rabin, Sea and Its Meanings, A Passage to Juneau. And what caught my attention was this description on the book jacket that said the inside passage from Puget Sound to Alaska is winding, turbulent, and deep. An ancient 1,000-mile-long sea route, rich in dangerous whirlpools, eddies, rips, and races. Here flourished the canoe culture of the Northwest Indians, with their fantastic painted masks and complex iconography, and their stories of malign submarine gods and monsters. So it looked like, and it said the unhappy British ship Discovery, captained by George Vancouver, came through these open reaches and narrow chasms in 1792. The early explorers were quickly followed by fur traders, settlers, missionaries, anthropologists, fishermen, and tourists, each with their own designs on this intricate and haunting sea. So I expected this to be a fairly respectful treatment of the history and his own experience of taking the same path and same voyage. But I have to caution you that there's a lot here that I'm sharing that I find offensive. I can only imagine how Indigenous nationals will feel about it. Why am I doing this? Well, because this book was published in 1999. And it demonstrates the attitude. This is a person who has no real background and no expertise in Indigenous nations and their nationals. He's read a few books and he's prepared, to take this particular journey. And he's sharing his observations. And I find his attitude so disrespectful, but it also, unfortunately, reflects the kinds of attitudes that remain prevalent today when non-native people observe and try to make sense of what are very important to Indigenous nationals. So he says here, the Indians spoke most directly through the paintbrush and the chisel. Plenty of examples of their art were collected by the early explorers between 1778 and 1800. Before the artists had had a chance to be influenced by their invaders. But their stories were nearly all transcribed much later, toward the end of the 19th century and after, when colonization, Christianity, and tourism, a mighty influence on native art, had so eroded the culture that little was left except rags and tatters. The translations of local languages into German and English were crude. The eager to please Indian tellers were already familiar with imported Bible stories and European folk tales. And when the collectors were faced with strange disjunctions, they provided transitions and linkages that gave these narratives the smooth shape of something by Aesop or the Brothers Grimm. They covered so this disrespect in terms of the continued sharing of both art. I mean, art. I know Indigenous nationals who are artists, and art has such a strong spiritual component. Very different, I would suggest, than non-native artists. I mean, certainly people express themselves through art, but I have not, and I'm certainly not an expert in art by any means, but in terms of my time with Indigenous nationals and the sense and feel I've had by holding their carvings, for example, and the gifts that I've been given from them, always felt so much more. And I was honored to be, to have my suspicions, if you will, that this was just like the dancing is not just dancing. The dancing, I've been brought to that place where those dancers go when they're dancing, and to allow me to understand in that moment what it's really all about. Same thing with the art. And so to hear that it's, been eroded, it's in tags, and this just is not true. But yet people reading this will view and look at this and say, okay, well, since it's so bastardized anyhow, I might as well buy the stuff that's made in China or what have you. He's speaking about maps, and they covered their emerging charts of the sea with names, naming it after themselves, their ships, their patrons, their national historic dates and occasions. The animist sea of the Indians was reinvented by the Europeans in the image of their own age, besides Vancouver, etc. So the description of what gets put on to reflect what's being seen. I don't really take an issue with that, but I haven't seen a lot of those old maps in terms of those depictions. And he now has the nerve and arrogance to speak to beliefs. Had the Indians always believed in a creator, a sky god, the Great Spirit, the Transformer, or was this a recent idea, picked up at Shaker Sunday School and merged with older native beliefs and stories? Did the totem pole, the most arresting symbol of Northwest Indian culture, date from time immemorial, or was it a product of fur trade wealth and fur trade leisure? In an unchronicled society without writing, things that happened yesterday bleed into ancient history. And after 100 years of rubbing up against explorers, traders, missionaries, and colonial administrators, the tribe members had ceased to be reliable authorities on their own traditions. Well, I completely disagree with that assumption. Not everybody carries the responsibility of all the stories. And while there may well be people who capitalize, if you will, on certain aspects of their culture, this is a completely unfair statement. These stories, the oral tradition, has proven time and again to be extremely reliable. Now, he's talking about one mild Saturday afternoon in January 1992. He was one of 2 white guests invited to Tallulah to watch a night of spirit dancing. Now, this is quite an honor. This is not powwow dancing, you know, in a commercial sense. This is a night of spirit dancing. And it's disturbing to see how he responds to and has the nerve to write this in his book, right? He says, I found there is a hitch in the arrangements. The dancing, which usually took place by firelight in the timber longhouse, had been shifted to the teen center, whose fierce strip lighting would rob it, I was warned, of some of its atmosphere. Quote, you'll have to use your imagination, end of quote, said my hostess, a tribal elder. It won't be quite the same tonight. So he speaks about, you know, everyone was seated. The dancing started with a sudden howl from a pear-shaped man in his 30s, wearing a burgundy-colored windbreaker with Tatulip Bingo on the back. Eyes squinched shut, twitching and moaning, he writhed in his chair, possessed by a spirit, then stumbled blindly to his feet and began to chant his spirit song in a certain tongue, neither English nor Lushootseed. His head, arms, and upper torso quaked violently as he gave vent to a long dirge of nonsense syllables. The man with the spirit did his dance, circled the floor in a series of ponderous and clumsy jumps, encouraged by the audience chant. To my profane eye, the dancer looked like an obese frog with the jitters. Can you imagine a more disrespectful way of referring to something he's had the honor of being invited to witness? And this is the attitude he brings to it. And as I said, reports on. The striplet dancers in the teen center were clearly miming possession by post-Christian Western-style spirits. Sometime between the 1850s and 1990s, the assumption of animal consciousness had turned into a religious rite, the dancer going into an ecstatic trance and speaking in tongues. Shaker worship, trance states, and holy shivers caught on. What I was seeing was a curious mixture of animist, tribal custom, Shakerism, and Pentecostalism, all refurbished for service in the late 20th century by white American anthros. How the hell does he know what he's seeing, and obviously is not open-minded to receiving and observing, but is concluding matters that he has absolutely no experience or expertise in. that it demonstrates the underlying racism, the underlying disrespect. And this, like I said, this is in 1999. This isn't at the turn of the century, the 1900s. I shouldn't have accepted the invitation. Yet what I'd seen was revelatory in its jumble of long disused customs, ecstatic Christianity, careless translation, ethnic pride, anthropology, New Age mysticism, and Oprah Winfrey style therapy. I had gone in the hope of finding a true fragment of the lost maritime culture of the coastal Indians, fat chance. Cast a lead line now into the turbid water of the Salish tribal past, and it would never touch bottom. I have been privileged to and honored to witness and be part of Salish and ceremonial practice. And I can tell you emphatically that my reaction to what I observed was a polar opposite of this. And this, keep in mind, was very early on in my exposure to Indigenous nations and their laws and their ceremonies. And as I said, it's hard to accept that not only he would carry that kind of attitude and that he would write it, but that this would get published. And people, of course, then always my concern, reading this kind of stuff, who know nothing, even less than this person, have not experienced any of that, think of the impression he provides, that it's okay to pass on this kind of commentary about something so sacred that it existed since time immemorial. And while there has been obviously interferences, things went underground, carriers of knowledge were outright murdered, nonetheless the core remains, and those ceremonies are extremely powerful, and they should be accorded the highest of respect, not this kind of commentary. Moving on, he speaks about Peter Puget command of Discovery's launch and ordered him to explore a long southward trending inlet. The boat was loaded with a week's provisions, firearms and ammunition, and a sack of trinkets. Discovery and Chatham had sailed from England with a bizarre cargo of knickknacks and novelties. A full 10,000 pounds value, a dizzying sum about 5.76 million at 1990s rates, was allocated for the purchase of assorted tools, tin kettles, beads, bracelets, Scottish tartans, ladies' garters, feathers, buttons, sheets of copper, iron bars, calico, red bays, earrings, and fireworks. Of course, that was intended to provide gifts in terms of the encounters with the Indigenous nationals that was sure to follow. He characterizes the attitude with those selections. He said it's a seduction scene. Puget is trying to fascinate the Indians as he might fascinate a girl. Sex is very close to the surface in these colonial encounters, with the Indians being thought of as irrational, impulsive, fickle, feminine. So Puget now tried to court them with pretty things that might please an 18th century's girl's eyes. And later on there's a quote that to recall on that, where he speaks about what Indigenous nationals really wanted. So we'll cover that in a bit. But now he said, people like to say that if America was a melting pot, Canada was a salad bowl. In Canada, immigrants kept their original identities and flavors, while in America they were assimilated into the cultural stew. If you came here as a spring onion, you could, this is talking about Canada, if you came here as a spring onion, you could stay a spring onion without anyone trying to turn you into a tomato or a cucumber. Well, not, of course, if you're an Indigenous national, because precisely what Canada continues to attempt to do through its application of policy is to fully assimilate. So if you've come here from somewhere else, fine, keep your original identity and such. You won't be forced to be assimilated. However, those people coming don't bring their land with them. Indigenous nationals treated differently. Why? Because they own the land. And it's that which Canada desires. So he said, I thought of Puget trying to woo the Indians with pretty things when what they really wanted were saws, chisels, copper, iron. In 1778, Cook wrote of the Indians of Nootka Sound, nothing would go down with our visitors but metal, and brass had by this time supplanted iron, being so eagerly sought after that before we left this place, hardly a bit of it was left in the ships, except what belonged to our necessary instruments. Whole suits of clothes were stripped of every button. Burrows of their furniture and copper kettles, tin canisters, candlesticks, and the like all went to wreck. So, you know, this concept of, well, they really just wanted beads, really was an assumption and wasn't actually what was coveted in terms of a trade item. So then a kind of statement could be made only because the systematic extermination of Indian languages, customs, and beliefs carried out by zealous Christian ministers and government agents had been so shockingly successful that no present-day Indian could possibly know what his great-great-great-grandparents had really believed. So it was now easy to attribute to the ancestors almost any belief that was thought desirable for them to have possessed. This is, again, what an assumption. Based on what evidence? Are you an expert in these matters? I have sat with many matriarchs, elders, teachers in Longhouse, and they have conveyed to me in their language. So they're required to be a translator, because they, even those that spoke English well, would not communicate the story in English. They insisted on speaking it truthfully in accordance with their language. And so then for my benefit only, and this hadn't usually been done before, they would have a translator to help convey the concepts. I can tell you, in terms of sitting there and listening to that, apart from whether you can understand those original languages or not, there is a feeling that comes over you. It's like you're taken back to an earlier time, and you're sitting there and you're hearing not the speaker who's speaking to you, but you're actually hearing it from a much earlier time. And the kinds of time frames that these stories, this history that's shared with me, go back way before great-great-great-great-grandparents. So again, that's such a misleading and disrespectful comment by this author. And it ends up, my last exposing you to this here. The early explorers viewed the Indians as creatures of whatever landscape they happened to inhabit. The natives were as much a part of the fauna as bears and wolves. The farther north the Vancouver expedition sailed, the more the Indians appeared to grow darker, dour, more granitic, and hostile, borrowing their character from the terrain in which they were encountered. The, quote, treacherous, end of quote, jabbering Tlinkits, Menzies' words, were the fiercest and most alien tribe that the whites had met so far. They incorporated in all their persons all the bad weather of the summer of 93, the frustrating, many-branched nature of what is now the Alexander Archipelago, the forbidding cliffs and impenetrable black forest of the wilderness. Had the travelers found them in settings like Zimovia Strait, the Indians would surely have been seen in a more favorable light. In fact, Vancouver's men were in far greater danger from the natives of Tahiti and Hawaii, but the English tourists then as now had fixed ideas about the character of people from the warm south and attributed to the Pacific Islanders an essentially sunny disposition, a love of pleasure, an un-English appetite for sex in the afternoons. The Tlinglets were northerners living on the same latitude as the citizens of Aberdeen. Parsimony and joylessness were what the English always expected of people of the north, and they were quick to nail the Tlinkets as surly, mean, and rowdy. So it's one thing to, as I have been doing, I've been reviewing a lot of older books and older times. But in my review and sharing that information, I've tried to clarify and demonstrate what's wrong with those attitudes. Here, this man, he not only repeats the inaccuracies, but he furthers them. He re-emphasizes it. It builds upon that in how he speaks of what he's experiencing and what he's read. And I think that's very wrong. And that's all I have to say.